Hi everybody, Dr. Ahles here. In this short video, we're going to talk about the process of summation, which is the way that neurons use more than one message to decide whether or not they're going to talk to their neighbors. So when we talk about summation, think about it literally like math. Unless math scares you, then don't think about it like math. When we talk about summation, what a neuron is doing is it's adding together more than one of the messages that it received. When it adds those messages together, that's going to help it figure out whether or not it should share this exciting news with its neighbor. There are two ways that neurons can do summation, or two ways they can add all of their messages together. The first way is what we call temporal summation. In temporal summation, the neuron is listening to just one presynaptic neuron. One neuron is talking to it, but it's talking to it a whole lot of times. Temporal means time. So in temporal summation, a neuron listens to one other neuron, and that other neuron talks and talks and talks. If I add all of those messages together from one neuron, I call this temporal summation. But a lot of the time, I'm not just listening to one presynaptic neuron, I'm actually listening to many different presynaptic neurons. If I'm listening to more than one presynaptic neuron, I call this spatial summation. So across the space of my cell, across all of my dendrites, I'm listening to or synapsing with many different presynaptic neurons. All of those neurons talking to me, if I add those messages together, that's called spatial summation. To help me remember the difference between these two types of summation, I like to think about summation kind of like the two ways that you could receive 99 messages in your text inbox. The first way we could receive 99 messages in our text inbox is that 99 messages came from one person. Now, if any person besides Captain Marvel was texting me, hey, 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 99 times, they would absolutely be blocked on my phone. But if Captain Marvel wants to text me 99 times to get my attention, I will allow it. Captain Marvel texting me repeatedly is an example of temporal summation. One neuron talking many times, me adding those messages together. More likely though than Captain Marvel texting me repeatedly would be me getting 99 messages because I've been added to one of those infamous group chats. So one person starts it, another person chats, and another and another. I have to add together the information from all the different people who are found all across the United States, potentially. That's a good example of spatial summation, where I have many different people talking or many different neurons talking, and I have to add all of that information together to figure out what's going on. Something I want you to underline, highlight, star underneath spatial summation is that spatial summation can include both EPSPs and IPSPs. Remember that EPSPs were excitatory postsynaptic potentials. Excitatory postsynaptic potentials are changes that make my membrane charge go up. So I can get messages that make me excited, that make my membrane charge go up. I can also receive IPSPs. IPSPs were inhibitory postsynaptic potentials. Neurons can only ever send one kind of message to their neighbors. Either I'm a neuron that sends excitatory messages and makes my neighbors get excited, their membrane charge goes up. Or I'm an inhibitory neuron. All of the messages that I send make my neighbor's membrane charge go down. If I'm going to hear two different kinds of messages, I have to be talking to more than one kind of neuron. So keep in mind the only time I can add both EPSPs and IPSPs together, the two different kinds of messages, has to be spatial summation. I have to be listening to more than one neuron. Let's discuss why summation would be helpful for a neuron. When a neuron is listening to a message, if it doesn't do summation, it gets that message makes a small little charge and change in its membrane charge, but it's not a lot, it's not very exciting, so my neuron goes back down to resting membrane potential, waiting to hear another message. It gets another message, that message is kind of cool, but not super cool, not enough to get it up above this thing called threshold, so it goes back down to its resting membrane potential. When a neuron is listening to another neuron, but it's not adding those messages together, it's harder for my neuron to get excited enough to talk to somebody else. When I start adding together messages, that's going to make it easier for me to recognize that I should depolarize, that I should get all the way positive and talk to my neighbor. So when we do temporal summation, remember, in temporal summation, one neuron talks to me, and it talks to me repeatedly. So I've received my first message from the neuron. My membrane charge went up a little bit, not quite enough for me to go all the way, but I receive another message from that same neuron, and I open up channels for that message too. When I open those channels, I do hit threshold, and at threshold, I completely go positive. I completely depolarize. So in temporal summation, we have one neuron that's talking to me, and it's repeatedly saying, fire, fire, fire. In neuron terms, this word fire just means talk to your neighbor. This one neuron telling me repeatedly that I should talk to my neighbors. Because of all the positive messages I'm getting, I will in fact talk to my neighbors. But remember that the other way I can receive excitatory messages is through spatial summation. Notice in spatial summation that two different dendrites that are talking to two different neurons are receiving those messages. And it just so happens that those two messages came at the same time, or very close to each other in time. And they changed my membrane charge enough that I did hit threshold and I get all the way positive. So the second way for me to add messages together, spatial summation, is like multiple different neurons all saying the same message. They're all saying, fire, fire, talk to your neighbor. That's spatial summation. Spatial summation, though, remember, doesn't have to just include those EPSPs. It doesn't have to just include the excitatory changes in membrane charge. We can actually do spatial summation with both IPSPs and EPSPs. I can add together both a message that makes my membrane charge go down and messages that make my membrane charge go up. So let's look at how this would translate to the charge on a neuron. The first message this neuron got was an excitatory message, a message that said, hey, talk to your neighbor. But it wasn't quite strong enough for that neuron to reach threshold, where it knew that it needed to talk to its neighbor. So it goes back down toward normal. On its way down to normal, it gets an inhibitory message. That inhibitory message makes its membrane charge go down lower, more negative. Well, over time, it'll slowly work its way back to its normal charge. Notice at this point, it received both an excitatory message and an inhibitory message. Those cancel each other out. As much as we don't like math, consider if I get a message that's -5 and I get a message that's +7, it only seems like I got a message of +2. I only get to go up a little bit. So when we're doing spatial summation with both EPSPs and IPSPs, we see a lot of canceling out. Sometimes I've got a neuron that's telling me that I should talk to my neighbor, but at the same time, another one's telling me not to. It's going to have to be a win or more EPSPs for me to overcome the IPSPs that tell me not to fire. So when you're looking at this question in the middle of your slide that asks how these things are different from each other, consider what we just talked about. How in this version of spatial summation, I'm getting positive messages and I'm getting negative messages. That makes it harder for my neuron to be able to talk to its neighbor. I like to equate, so this is a good picture for us that shows us the reality of neurons. The reality of a neuron is it has several green neurons talking to it, several excitatory neurons talking to it, but at the same time it also has several inhibitory neurons, or these red neurons, talking to it. Your neurons are constantly considering the messages from all kinds of different other presynaptic neurons to decide whether or not they should be talking to another. And I kind of like to consider your neurons a lot like Kronk from The Emperor's New Groove. Old school movie, but perfect to illustrate our point. Kronk is trying to decide what he should do. On one shoulder, he has an angel telling him the right things or the positive things to do. On the other shoulder, he has a demon telling him the negative things or the mean things he could do. In summation, our neurons, just like Kronk, have to decide whether or not they're going to act on these different messages. That's how the process of summation works.